how costs change at different possible rates of output, and what are some of the regularities that we see in the operation of different firms that we could to build into a model of that would be accurate in describing the operation of the firm. So we'll be investigating the different elements of cost. Obviously, there are some costs which are fixed cost that don't change as we change the rate of production, such as my lease or my rent. There are some costs that do change as I increase the level of production, such as wages and use of utilities and electricity. We call those variable costs. So we'll talk about the different elements of cost and, in fact, graph them. And then the question we're seeking to answer for the firm is, what is the right rate of output to maximize economic profits? As we indicated in our previous discussion, the owner has an incentive now to think about revenue and costs to try to choose the rate of production that maximizes the economic profitability. So the example I want to use is we're going to open a factory to produce what economists call widgets. A widget is the name economists give to a product, and so that's going to be what we're going to open a factory to produce widgets. I'm going to be opening it because I have experience in working in the production of widgets. Maybe I managed a widget production facility for someone else. And this is, by the way, where this is how most businesses start. Individual gets some skills and learns about an industry while working for someone else, and then goes off and works individually. I may have talked about an example when I was running the firm. We had really wonderful holiday parties, and the senior secretary came, delightful person, and she was married, and her husband came, and it was at Jimmy's restaurant in Hollywood, so it was really an expensive, really an expensive evening, and we had a band and this private room and all kinds of things. And I met this guy, Alan, and he was dressed in kind of casual linen slacks, and he was wearing sandals, and this is a really big social event at Jimmy's. So we were chatting, and I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I mix ink." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, mixing ink." And I didn't think much of it. It turns out, as I learned later, that when you're printing, there are all kinds of specializations in the inks that are used to print different kinds of material. Obviously, newsprint has a really cheap ink that smudges and so forth. And then you move up to different materials like glossy paper. Well, that requires a different kind of ink. And then certain colorations require specialization and so forth. So think of moving up to the Mercedes brochure that's given out and the quality of that and the paper that it's printed on. He had worked for a company called Los Angeles Ink, Los Angeles Ink Inc., and he was a sales representative. And they had two facilities downtown that were the mixing machines. And so they would get orders in from the printers all over Los Angeles, and they would mix the ink according to the specifications, and then they would have runners and technicians who would take the ink out to the location, give it to the printers, and deliver it. When the printers began to print, if there was some problem with the process, they had to call up the company. The company had to send another technician out, perhaps someone who had not done the original mixing, and try and solve the problem. And if you're printing, you all understand that's the last step before delivering the product to whatever your media is. The very last step is the actual printing. So if it doesn't work out well, there's a delay, and that's very costly to the printers. So Alan was very successful. He got to know all these printers, particularly in the west side of the city. And he went out on his own, and he went to these companies, and he said to them, "I'll tell you what, if you give me 100 square feet in your building, like a major printer in Santa Monica. If you give me 100 square feet, which is a 10 by 10 area, I'll put a mixing machine right on your property. And when you have a mixing job, I'll send the technician out with the various inks, and they'll mix it right on the spot. And then the tech will stay while you begin the printing process. So if there's a problem, the tech number one knows exactly what he did, what the proportions were. He can look at the problem and evaluate what was the problem with the ink. He can remix immediately and go forward. And obviously, he didn't put a mixer in every printer, but he put one in the major printer in Santa Monica, and then they would do the printing there for all the small job shops in Santa Monica. So it was much closer again to the actual customers, and he was extremely successful. And think about the cost savings. He saved the rent on a major manufacturing building. All he needed was some storage, and after he customized what kind of jobs were being done at different locations, he knew ahead of time what kinds of inks he needed to store at those particular locations. The guy was a multimillionaire, and had done extremely well, a real entrepreneur. So part of my telling the story is when you meet someone who perhaps isn't dressing exactly the way you would, you don't want to automatically assume that the person is not, in fact, successful. So I've had experience making widgets. We're going to open this shop, and I sign and before I go in, before I sign any leases or anything else, I'm making what kind of decisions? Right, long run decisions, and because nothing is fixed. I decide to lease a building on a 5-year lease, and this is in Montana, and the price is $30 per day. And I decide to lease the equipment, and for a 5-year lease, I get 2 machines, and the cost of that is $20 per day. Notice that once I've signed those leases, then in fact those are fixed costs for this 5-year period. I'm assuming it's more costly to break the lease than to pay it off in what I owe. But a third factor I have to think about is my opportunity cost of being there running this company as opposed to what I could be doing. Remember, economic cost is always opportunity cost. So I would add in as a cost, as an economic cost, what I was making down the street managing this other company, which for purposes of our example is $50 per day. So the firm now, once we're in business, has total fixed cost of $100 per day. These are costs that don't change if I produce 0 widgets or if I produce a large number. In our notation, total fixed cost equals 100. To explain a hypothetical method of manufacturing widgets, I would tell you the following story. There are 2 machines. They require a worker to be running the machine as it's producing. You can't just set it up automatically, and so the workers have to be at the location next to the machine, and the process is that they begin by opening that garage door on the far side and bringing in these long 10-foot 6-inch diameter pipes, which are the input to the process. And they have to load them into the machine, and then they turn the machine on. The first process is that a saw blade comes down and skims. It's rotating like in a lathe. Saw blade comes down, skims off the outside to make an even level, and it moves down. And then the next is that it cuts the pipe off into certain lengths, and it moves down. And then they're turned upright, and a capping machine comes down and puts a cap on them, and they move down, and then they're threaded on the bottom. And then they drop off into these wicker baskets that we've indicated. And then to finish the process, they're taken over to this square, which is a sonic acid bath, and they're put in to eat away any of the little bits of metal that cling to the product, which is called flash. And it's sonic so that the parts are vibrating, and the acid gets to all the parts evenly. They then put it onto the workbench, saran wrap it, shrink wrap it, and it's ready to go. So those are the steps involved in this production process. As we now think about different rates of production, we can think about different elements of cost. We'll talk about the total cost, which would be the sum of the fixed cost and the variable cost. We'll think about the average cost of production, or average total cost, which is the total amount being spent divided by the number of units being produced, total cost divided by quantity. We'll think about average fixed and average variable cost as we want to solve certain kinds of problems about the best rate of production. And also we'll calculate marginal cost. And as we've said, marginal cost is the additional cost of one more unit of output. And that's significant in terms of determining the correct rate. That's going to be the element of cost that I'm going to look at in trying to figure out the best rate of production. So I have some data that indicates with different numbers of workers the expected rate of production in total that I could anticipate, and also how much each worker adds to additional units of output called marginal product. Marginal product means additional output from each additional worker. And this kind of data I would be able to estimate from my experience running a widget factory. Also, the manufacturer of these machines often will provide me with data on how this 5-spindle Davenport machine could operate with different numbers of workers associated with it. So this kind of technical data is something that would be available to the manager of the store. The numbers are significant because they reflect certain regularities in the aspect of adding workers to a fixed amount of equipment in terms of additional output or marginal product. You'll notice that one worker all by himself is able to produce 10 widgets per day. He has to go through all the steps we talked about. It may take him 45 minutes to load that 10-foot 6-inch diameter pipe into the machine. Then he has to run the machine. The other machine's not running. Then when he's doing the acid bath monitoring, no machines are running. So in a day, if he does all these activities, he can produce about 10 units of output. If I add a second worker, my anticipated rate of production would be 25 units per day. And the marginal product of the second worker is higher than the first worker. It's not because he or she differs in their abilities. It's because of the benefits of expanding the team, the benefits of teamwork and specialization. Think about my example again. With 2 workers in the morning, they can go out and open the garage door and then just pick up a piece of pipe, carry it in 5 minutes, load it, go back out, get the second piece carried in, load it. So within 10 minutes, both machines are up and ready to run. Both machines are running except when they do maintenance or have lunch or whatever. And one machine can run longer because only one of them is necessary to monitor the acid bath in that way. So the second worker adds 15 units of output, teamwork and specialization. In my example, the third worker actually adds 20 units of output. And so total output with 3 workers would be 45 units. Why might the third worker add that much? Well, notice that if I have 3 workers now, they can load the machines as we talked about. And then when worker 1 takes a lunch break from 11 to 12, the third worker can step in, keep the machine running. Second worker takes his lunch break from 1 to 2. Third worker can step in, keep the machine running. The third worker can monitor the acid bath for the output of both individuals, so they keep working on the machines. So the third worker adds 20 units to output. And again, that rising marginal product is the benefit of teamwork and specialization. But you'll notice as I add a 4th worker and then a 5th and then a 6th, the additional output is beginning to decline. Marginal product is not the same. It's not rising. It's beginning to decline. And the reason is that I'm in the range of what's called diminishing returns. And that is that I only have two machines. I already have three people, and then four, and then five. And so you can't get the machines to operate that much more intensively. The intensity of additional workers, the addition of additional workers does not give you the same increased intensity of utilization of the machines. Let's say we're at six workers now, and so I have two teams of three, and my total output is approximately 86 units. The last guy added about 10 units to that level of productivity. It might be that the seventh worker, all he does is goes around and cleans up. I'm sorry, let me do maintenance first. All he does is to perform maintenance on the machines while they are running. While you're doing the saw with the skimming, he can change out the threader. While you're doing the threading, he can go back and change out the saw blades. So you get a little bit of additional time because you can do this maintenance without a downtime. And he adds about 5 units of productivity per day. The eighth worker, maybe all I have him specialize in doing is going around and cleaning up the floor, cleaning up any spills or picking up parts from the floor. During World War II, when we had established a great deal of manufacturing that had not been done before, such as aircraft manufacturing and other things that we were doing on a war footing, they used to cover the floor with about 4 inches of sawdust. And the reason was, and everybody wore steel-toed shoes, as they still do today, but the reason for the sawdust was that if you drop things like tools or nuts or bolts or so forth, they go into the sawdust and you don't trip over them. And the same thing with oil spills or liquid spills. They're absorbed by the sawdust, so you don't slip and fall in that particular manner. And so in this example, maybe the eighth worker simply cleans up constantly, and because of that, the other workers are more don't have to be as cautious. They can move more rapidly. We get about 4 units of additional output. I consider hiring a ninth worker. Maybe all he does is to sing. Maybe all he does is to sing, and he provides a pleasant background for production. In the 1950s, AT&T was the monopoly of telephones in the United States, and they had Bell Labs was their manufacturing facility, and they were located in Hawthorne. One plant was located in Hawthorne, Illinois, and that was the assembly plant. And by the way, at that time, you didn't buy phones; you rented them from AT&T. You had to use their equipment, and it was very, very well made, but you had to pay a lease price on it every month. And so industrial psychologists and industrial economists went in to try and find ways of increasing productivity. And they went in and they noticed the first thing was that the walls were painted this really ugly gray industrial color. So they painted the walls in pastels, and output went up. And so they made notes about it. The workers seemed to appreciate that. And then they increased the number of light fixtures, and output went up. And they made a note, increasing the light increased output. And then they decided they were going to put in music. And the name of the company, by the way, is called Muzak. They're the ones who make and distribute what you all call doctor's office music or elevator music, or that orchestral music that is soft and it's kind of standard songs that you know, but it's in the background. And in doing that, they had to take out some of the light fixtures to put the speakers in the ceiling. And in the process, as they took out those light fixtures, output went up. Well, now they're really, this is a conundrum, because when I increased the amount of light, output went up. When I decreased the amount of light, output went up. What is in fact going on? It was a tremendous breakthrough in the understanding of what motivates employees. And that was the motivational factor was the fact that you were doing things to try to make their life better. That is where the increased output came from, was the increased attitude on their part that in fact you were trying to make their lives better. I visited a General Motors production plant many years ago that was located in Van Nuys, and it was fascinating to see the things that they were doing. All production was done in teams. They had blue team, red team, they had night shift teams, and they were competing with each other. And they didn't get salary benefits from winning the quality item of competition or the lowest amount of downtime on the line competition, but they got recognition for it. And so there really was competition between the teams because that was exciting to people to be recognized. You all know in many of the retail places you go to, they post the employee of the month, the picture of the individual, and they found that incentivizes people to work more. And finally, my 10th individual, maybe all that person does is go around and compliment people like, oh, nice widget there, good looking widget, I like your shirt too. And I get about one more unit of output for doing that. But in every firm, whether it's Honda Motor Corporations in Maryville, Ohio with 3,000 workers or whatever, marginal product will have this kind of a shape to it. And that is, at first, marginal product goes up. That's the benefits of teamwork and specialization. Eventually, though, at some point, you run into this law of diminishing returns. And the law of diminishing returns states that once you've hit that point, as you add more of one input to a fixed amount of other inputs, marginal product goes down. Marginal product is positive, but it's declining, and eventually it can become, in fact, negative. Freeze the number of workers at 10, and then think about adding square footage to the building. And so everything's fixed except the square footage. Well, as I expand the square footage, my suspicion is that people could move around more easily. I had 10 people, remember, crowded into that space. And as I expand the number of square footage, output would go up. But as I continue to do that, it wouldn't continue to go up at the same rate. You'd run into diminishing marginal returns. The same thing would be true of adding equipment. If I expand the building and then I start adding machines, output would go up. But as I add more machines, you would see this law of diminishing returns come about at some particular point. Notice there are only 3 laws in economics. That's how simple the science is. First law of demand was what? You charge a higher price, people buy less. Second law of demand, the longer the time period after a price change, the more people respond, the greater the elasticity over time. And the third is the law of production, the law of diminishing returns in production. So as I said, marginal product, if we were to graph it, looks like this. It has a range where it's increasing, that's teamwork and specialization, and then a range where it's decreasing, and that is diminishing marginal returns. Understanding those changes in marginal product, and by the way, I'm assuming the wage in this example was constant per worker at $20 per day. I can now calculate my total cost at different rates of production with different numbers of workers, and I can also calculate marginal cost as I add in these workers. How much does cost per unit change in that way? So if I produce 0 units in my example, I had $100 of fixed cost, so my cost would be $100 once I'm in business. The first worker adds $20, so my total cost would be $120. And then as you go across, as I add workers, total cost is increasing by 20 because each each additional worker is costing me $20 per day. To calculate marginal cost at these different possible rates of production, I would take the additional cost as I move to the next worker, which is 20 units. I would divide by additional output, which is marginal product. So marginal cost is the change in total cost, delta TC, divided by MP, the marginal product of output. The first worker cost went up by $20, output went up by 10, so each unit had a marginal cost of $2. For the second worker, cost went up by 20, output went up by 15, a larger amount. So marginal cost declined to 133. Notice for the third worker, I spent an additional $20. Output went up by an additional 20 units. And so marginal cost over that range was $1 per unit. But as marginal product declines, and each time it cost me 20 additional dollars, as marginal product declines, marginal cost increases. And you can see that from comparing the marginal product row with the marginal cost row. Marginal cost after the third worker, 17 additional units, marginal cost 118, and then 14 additional units, marginal cost 143, and then $2, and then $4 as marginal product is declining, $5, $10, and the last unit I add $20 to total cost and I only get one additional unit. So that unit costs me 20 additional dollars, marginal cost of 20. As you look at this, your first glance might be, where would you want to produce? Well, we don't know yet because we don't know revenue, but you might think, well, I ought to produce with 2 workers because that's the minimum of marginal cost. And the question is, would you ever hire this 10th worker? Would you ever hire this 10th worker? And immediately your thought would probably be, well, no, he cost you $20. That unit cost you $20. But now think about the following. Suppose you could sell each widget for $25. So you could sell every widget and get $25 for it. In that case, you can see it would be worthwhile hiring this last guy because that unit would add $25 to revenue, marginal revenue, add $20 to cost, and it would add or contribute $5 towards profitability. So we don't know yet where we're going to produce, but we do know that marginal cost in every firm is going to have this kind of a shape to it. Declining region, benefits of teamwork and specialization, rising marginal product, and then a rising marginal cost as you run into diminishing marginal returns. Drawing it as a line graph is what we normally do. It would look like this, a declining region, then rising, and then rising more rapidly. If you were to describe this visually to someone, how might you describe it? How might you say this is what it looks like? Some of you have said a J curve, and that makes sense. It's like the letter J. We used to say it looks like a fishhook curve, but a lot of people don't fish anymore. So one of my students said it looks like a Nike curve because it's declining and then rising more rapidly. But every firm, and this is the beauty of the simplicity of this modeling that we're doing, for every firm, marginal cost is going to look like this. Now, it will be different rates of production depending on the size of the plant and those kinds of things. But marginal cost will have this kind of a shape to it. Finally, what about per unit cost? What can we say about average cost? Well, we can calculate that on the chart. Average is total divided by total quantity, total cost divided by total quantity. That would be the total cost divided by the row of quantity to get the per unit cost of production at that particular rate. And if you have one worker, total cost is 120. That one worker is able to produce a total of 10 units, so my per unit cost would be $12. If I hire a second worker, output is now 25, goes up by more than double, and my per unit cost falls by more than a half, 560. 3 workers is a total of 45 units divided into total cost of 160, 355 per unit. And then it falls to 290, then it falls to 264, 256, up to that point. So at first, average cost is falling very dramatically and then continues to fall to a certain point less rapidly. The major reason for that initial decline being as rapid as it is the reduction in average fixed cost. Take a different example. Suppose you had fixed cost of $1,000 and you produced 1 unit. So what would your average fixed cost be? 1,000 divided by 1 unit would be an average fixed cost of $1,000. As soon as you produce 2 units, calculate average fixed cost. $1,000 divided by 2 would immediately drop it in half to $500. At 10 units, 1,000 divided by 10 would be $100 average cost. 1,000 units would be, what did I say? 1,000 would be $10 per unit. No, I'm sorry, 1,000 would be $1 per unit. 10,000 would be 10 cents per unit. 100,000 would be 1 cent per unit. At 1,000,000, the average cost would be 10 cents. It would be 1 cent or 1/10 of a cent. I'm sorry. At 1,000,000 units, it's 1/10 of a cent. So you can see average fixed cost declines rapidly and then continues to decline, but more slowly in that particular way. So average cost is being pulled down initially by that declining average fixed cost. Eventually, it is pulled up by the rising average variable cost of production. So average cost has this kind of a shape. It's a bowl-shaped curve. Declines rapidly and then eventually goes up. So you can draw it as a bowl-shaped curve, and you will have captured the characteristics that are regularities in average cost of production for every business in the range where the average cost is falling. That's the initial increasing rate of production. We define that as the range of what we call economies of scale. Economies of scale. And that's a good thing. That means that when the firm is enjoying economies of scale, as I increase the rate of production, average cost is falling. And that's this first range on the diagram, the range of economies of scale in production. The firm would like to expand production in that range because the per unit cost is coming down. The average cost per unit, the average cost is the same as the per unit cost in terms of language. Beyond that minimum point, average cost is rising, and we define that as the range of diseconomies. Of diseconomies of scale. Diseconomies. Dis is a bad thing, right? Dissing you. So in the range where you're expanding the rate of production, but your per unit costs are going up, then in fact that's the range of diseconomies of scale. So it's the second portion of the average cost curve. The average cost curve need not be symmetrical as I've drawn it here. It has a declining range and it has an increasing range, depending upon the techniques of production and those kinds of aspects. Finally, the last interrelationship that we would like to understand is the interrelationship between marginal cost, remember that's the additional cost of each additional unit, and average cost, the per unit cost of each unit as you're expanding production. Well, marginal cost will always intersect average cost at the minimum of average cost. Marginal cost will always come through that minimum point on the average cost curve. And the way to see that is an example. Suppose I calculate the average height of the people in the room. How would I do that? Add up all the individual heights, divide by the number of people, and I would get 5'8", let's say, is the average height for this quantity of people that are in the room, for this rate of production. If the next person who walks in, that's the marginal person, is only 2 feet tall, what would happen to the new average? It would go down, right? Because the marginal is below the average, it's pulling the average down. Well, that's exactly what you can see on the graph. In the range where average cost is falling, marginal cost is below the average cost. it's coming up and getting closer to it, which means it's not pulling it down as rapidly, which means average cost is declining less rapidly as you approach that minimum point. Beyond the minimum point, marginal cost is above the average cost. The next person who walks in is 7 feet tall. The new average, including that person, would go up because the marginal is above the average. So in terms of cost, the same thing is true. Once you've reached the minimum, beyond that, the marginal is above the average, and in that range, the average is rising. So if marginal is below the average, it's coming down. If marginal is above the average, it's going up. And so you can see it relate to the range where the average is falling, marginal is below average, the range where it's rising, marginal is above average. To correctly depict the cost relationships for every business firm, you want to be able to draw this drawing from memory because it captures these realities of the laws of production and cost. The way to do it is draw the axes first, draw dollars in the vertical, so I'm measuring cost as a height, draw the rate of production or quantity on the horizontal, and then draw in the average cost curve first, just draw in a bowl-shaped curve, label it AC, average cost, or average total cost, or per unit cost. Those are all the same thing. They mean the average cost. Find the minimum point, draw your J-curve through that minimum, draw your marginal cost curve through that minimum point, the J shape, and you have a correct cost relationship between marginal and average cost for every business firm, no matter what model of competition we talk about in the next modeling of that. The cost curves are going to look like this, and so it is a regularity. So by all means, study these relationships. Take your time as you go through, think them through. What does that mean? Test yourself. What does diseconomy of scale mean? What is the diminishing returns law? What does that apply to, etc. And then also one piece of advice. We use these notations of ATC and MC and so forth. Whenever you draw the curves, you want to label them, and usually just with the letters. But when you read it, always refer to it as what it stands for. Never say the MC curve or the AC curve. Always, when you look at it, say marginal cost, say average cost. And here's the reason why. If you just do it with letters, it's meaningless, right? There's nothing that would tell me that TBC plus plus AFC is equal to ATC or something. The letters don't mean anything. So if you always refer to them as what they stand for, then it makes sense. Average total cost, average total, would be the sum of average fixed cost and average variable cost. That makes sense to me, right? Marginal cost. If marginal cost is above the average cost, average is coming up. So always refer to it in that particular way. So that concludes our discussion of the rates of production and the categories of cost.